thing I want to point out before he gets into his 3 points. So specifically last week, but I know I've talked about it before. As pastors, we have this choice of how much are we going to cover in a sermon. And what happens, and what's happened a few times when we've covered sermons, doing sermon reviews, is that we see that sometimes pastors bite off way too much of a chunk, right? So here's, as pastors, right? Hopefully, if you're not a pastor and you're watching this, you can kind of maybe listen for this next time or watch for this. But as pastors, it's really hard for us to either say, okay, I'm going to bite off this huge chunk and then try to cover that huge, maybe it's a whole chapter, try to cover all of that well. Also, sometimes we go the opposite direction and say, I'm only going to cover these couple verses. And then like we just are bending over backwards trying to get enough out of it to actually make a whole sermon out of it. So it's really, it's an interesting exercise to do if you've ever prepared a sermon, or maybe you're preparing to be a pastor, trying to learn how to preach. It's this real balance of saying, how much here do I want to take on in today's sermon, because it could be too much and then I don't do an adequate job of actually covering all of it, or it could be too little and then now I'm putting filler in order to fill my sermon out. Josh, as he's preaching through Luke here, he covers a paragraph. Now this gives, again, not that this is the perfect way to do it, but this gives you enough wiggle room to say, this is just a paragraph, so that if I need to draw from before or after, I can, but also, especially if I'm bringing in other verses to contextually kind of frame this a bit, or to show where maybe these verses kind of point outward into other texts, then that gives me a little leeway to do that. But just for those of you that are pastors or preparing to be pastors or trying to learn how to even just speak, this doesn't just apply to preaching, but the idea is here's how much am I going to cover that I can do so really well without being like too overwhelmed. So he mentioned that it's in the paragraph today, this little section. Thought I'd bring that up because sometimes, again, it's this real balance of saying how much is too much, how little is too little, and kind of trying to figure that out. This is also why I would very much encourage you, if you're a pastor learning how to preach, you write these out and you study for them well in advance so you can kind of practice through them a few times to kind of get the feel of the flow, kind of get the feel of what you want to say. There's been numerous times when I'm preparing for a sermon and I give it to myself a couple times and go, oh, I forgot to add that. That's like a really important point. And then that gives me an opportunity to put that in, and I wouldn't have normally thought about that. Or it gives me an opportunity to say, that's too much, I need to cut it down a little bit. So just as an encouragement there, that's a good idea as well.
And first of all, I want us to see the messenger of good news in verse number 26. The messenger of good news. And then following the messenger, we will see the miraculous details of the gospel, or the miraculous details of the story of good news, followed up with the actual message itself, the message of good news.
What you just watched was a short clip from one of our sermon reviews. If you're interested in the rest of the review, make sure you check out the link in the description below.